Nobody in the small recording studio in Hongdae knew that the woman auditioning under the name Yuna had a Nigerian passport buried at the bottom of her suitcase with a different name printed inside it. And by the time anyone found out, it would be far too late to undo what her lie had already set in motion. If you love a story that starts with a secret and only gets more dangerous from there, subscribe to this channel right now, because this one is going to test exactly how far you'll follow. A woman who built her entire life on a single lie. Her real name was Amarachi Eze, and 6 months earlier she had been a moderately successful session vocalist in Lagos, singing backup for artists more famous than she would likely ever become, watching her own original songs get quietly passed over by every label she approached. She did not plan to become someone else. It happened the way most disasters happen. Gradually, then all at once, born from a single moment of opportunism she told herself at the time was harmless. She had grown up in Seoul, the second of 4 children, raised primarily by a mother who cleaned offices overnight and a father who drove a commercial bus until his knees gave out, neither of them with the spare income or spare time to indulge a daughter's obsession with singing beyond the church choir that first revealed how good her voice actually was. By 19 she was working studio sessions for a fraction of what the artists she backed were paid, building a reputation among Lagos producers as reliable, technically gifted, and almost entirely invisible, the kind of voice that made other people's songs better without anyone outside the industry ever learning her name. She had auditioned for 3 different labels over 4 years, each rejection delivered with some version of the same explanation. Talented, certainly, but not quite what they were looking for, a phrase she eventually understood to mean she lacked whatever ineffable quality separated a featured artist from permanent background labor. The opportunity arrived through a Korean entertainment company scouting for what they called global diversity talent, a slightly clinical phrase for an initiative to add non-Korean members to a new girl group designed for international appeal. The company, Crown Wave Entertainment, had already selected most of its lineup, but their final slot, reserved specifically for a vocalist with both technical skill and a compelling personal story for marketing purposes, had fallen through at the last moment when their chosen candidate, a Korean-Nigerian trainee named Yuna Bassey, withdrew abruptly for what the company described only as family reasons, forfeiting a position she had trained 3 years to earn. Amarachi had never met Yuna Bassey. She knew her only because Yuna's audition tape, leaked from an internal company server by a disgruntled junior staffer trying to expose unfair industry practices, had circulated briefly online before being taken down, and Amarachi, scrolling through it during a sleepless night in Lagos, had been struck by an uncomfortable, vertiginous realization. She and Yuna looked enough alike in voice and in face that a stranger glancing quickly at both their photographs might mistake one for the other. What began as idle curiosity became, over the following 2 weeks, something far more reckless. Amarachi discovered, through patient digging in industry forums, that Yuna's withdrawal had happened so suddenly that Crown Wave Entertainment hadn't yet updated its internal records, hadn't yet informed the broader public, and was, according to one leaked internal memo, desperate to fill the final slot before their group's debut showcase in 6 weeks or risk losing their already booked international promotional slots. Amarachi told herself she was only curious when she submitted an audition video using Yuna's company-issued trainee ID number, recovered from a different leaked document, alongside her own voice, her own face, and a story she fabricated almost entirely from details she'd gathered about the real Yuna's background. She never expected them to actually believe her. Something extraordinary and deeply dangerous is about to happen to a woman who never meant her lie to go this far. And if you want to watch every twist of it unfold, make sure you're subscribed, because you do not want to come into the story halfway through. Crown Wave Entertainment, under brutal time pressure and operating across a chaotic transition between 2 department heads, did not catch the discrepancy. Amarachi's voice was, if anything, more technically accomplished than the real Yuna's audition tape had suggested, and her face, while not identical, was close enough in lighting and angle that nobody flagged it as unusual. International trainees often look different in person than in old footage, after all, and nobody at the company had ever met Yuna Bassey face-to-face, since her training had been conducted primarily online from Nigeria before her sudden, mysterious withdrawal. By the time Amarachi landed in Seoul, carrying a suitcase with her real passport hidden beneath a false bottom she'd had a tailor friend construct in Lagos, she had already signed a contract under a name that was not hers, accepted housing in a company dormitory under an identity that was not hers, and begun training alongside for other young women who had no reason whatsoever to doubt that she was exactly who she claimed to be. This is where the story should have collapsed immediately, where any reasonable person watching from the outside would expect Amarachi's deception to unravel within days. Instead, against every probability, it held for 3 full months, through grueling 12-hour training days, vocal lessons, choreography sessions, and Korean language classes. Amarachi performed not just as a singer but as an entirely different woman, learning to answer to a name that wasn't hers with a fluency that frightened her more each week. It was in the 3rd month, during a particularly brutal vocal coaching session, that she met Taeyong Han, a soft-spoken composer attached to the group's debut album, who had been hired specifically because of his unusual specialty, blending West African vocal traditions with K-pop production, a niche skill he developed after spending 2 formative years studying music in Lagos himself during his 20s, a period of his life he rarely discussed but which had clearly left a permanent mark on the way he wrote melody. If this twist is making your stomach drop a little, that's exactly the feeling this channel exists to give you. So go ahead and subscribe now before the story pulls you in any further. Taeyong noticed things about Yuna that nobody else at the company seemed to catch. Small inconsistencies in her Korean that didn't match someone who had supposedly trained primarily online from Lagos for 3 years, an instinctive familiarity with specific Lagos neighborhoods and slang that felt too lived in for someone whose official biography placed her primarily in a different Nigerian city entirely. He said nothing at first, telling himself it was none of his business, that perhaps the company's files were simply inaccurate, the way corporate paperwork on trainees often was. But the longer he worked with her, arranging her vocal parts late into the night in the company's smaller practice rooms, the more he found himself drawn not to suspicion but to something far more complicated. A genuine, unshakable attraction to the woman in front of him, regardless of whatever name she answered to. She wrote harmonies instinctively, the way only someone who had spent years actually living and breathing Lagos's music scene could, layering Yoruba vocal runs into Korean pop melodies with an authenticity that no amount of online trainee coaching could have manufactured. Taeyong, who had spent years quietly grieving the end of his own time in Lagos and the relationship he'd left behind there, found himself falling for Yuna specifically because she felt, in ways he couldn't fully articulate even to himself, more genuinely connected to the place he loved than her official biography suggested she should be. Amarachi, for her part, fell for him with a guilt that grew heavier every single day, aware that every conversation, every shared laugh over late night, ramen in the studio kitchen, every moment of growing intimacy, was built on a foundation that could collapse the instant anyone checked her passport against company records. She told herself repeatedly that she would end things before they went further, that she owed it to him not to let him fall in love with a person who didn't, technically, exist. She never managed to do it. By the 4th month, as the group's debut showcase approached and rehearsals intensified into something resembling a pressure cooker, Amarachi and Taeyong had become, in the careful, deniable language of idol industry relationships, something neither of them was supposed to have, built on a lie only one of them knew was being told. What neither of them knew, what neither of them could have anticipated, was that the real Yuna Bassey was not, as Amarachi had assumed, simply a withdrawn trainee, who had moved on with her life. She was, in fact, recovering in a Lagos hospital from a serious car accident that had nearly killed her 3 days before her scheduled final evaluation. An accident that had left her in a medically induced coma for nearly 2 months, unable to contact anyone, her family too overwhelmed by her medical crisis to think to formally notify a Korean entertainment company about the daughter they were desperately trying to keep alive. You are not ready for what happens when Yuna wakes up, and if you don't want to stumble onto a spoiler before we get there, subscribe now so this story comes straight to you instead of leaving it to chance. Yuna Bassey woke from her coma in the 5th month of Amarachi's deception, disoriented, weakened, but alive, and one of her very first coherent thoughts, once her mother explained how much time had passed, was of the audition results she'd missed, the dream she'd built since childhood that she assumed had simply slipped away from her during the worst months of her life. It took her physical therapist 3 additional weeks to clear her for the kind of travel and stress involved in reaching out to Crown Wave Entertainment to formally apologize for her unexplained absence and inquire, with the faint, almost embarrassed hope of someone expecting rejection, whether there might be any other opportunities available to her in the future. The email Yuna sent, polite and apologetic, found its way to a deputy in Crown Wave's artist management department who had not been involved in the original trainee transition and who, reading it with mounting confusion, pulled up the company's official roster to check Yuna Bassey's current status, only to find her listed as an active, debuted member of the company's newest girl group, currently 3 weeks away from a major international promotional tour. The deputy, assuming some kind of administrative error rather than outright fraud, forwarded the discrepancy to her supervisor, who forwarded it to legal, who forwarded it within 48 hours, directly to the CEO's office, where it landed on a desk belonging to a notoriously exacting executive named Director O, a woman who had built Crown Wave's reputation on meticulous control and who viewed any threat to that control, however accidental, as an existential crisis requiring immediate surgical resolution. Amarachi learned that something was wrong not through any direct confrontation, but through the sudden, unexplained silence of people around her. A choreographer who avoided eye contact during practice, a stylist who canceled a fitting without explanation, Taeyong himself growing quieter and more anxious over 2 days, clearly aware of something he wasn't yet permitted to share. The confrontation, when it finally came, took place not in some dramatic boardroom scene but in a small, windowless meeting room on the company's 4th floor, where Director O sat across from her with a single folder, opened it without a word, and slid across a printed copy of Amarachi's actual Nigerian passport photo, Obtained through a private investigator the company had quietly hired the moment the discrepancy surfaced. "You have one chance to tell me the truth," Director O said, in English clipped precise enough to feel more threatening than any raised voice could have. "Who are you? And where is the real Yuna Bassey? If you've ever wondered what it feels like for a lie to finally catch up with someone in real time, you're about to watch it happen. And the only way to make sure you see how this ends is to subscribe before this video keeps going." Amarachi did not deny it. She had rehearsed, in private, imagined versions of this exact moment for months, and every version had involved some kind of desperate justification, some explanation of her talent, her hunger, her years of being overlooked in Lagos, the unfairness of an industry that handed opportunities to whoever happened to already be standing in the right room. Faced with the actual moment, she found she had nothing to say except the truth, delivered flatly, without excuse. She had lied, she had stolen another woman's identity and opportunity, and she understood that whatever came next, she had no right to argue against it. What Director O did next surprised everyone involved, including, eventually, Amarachi herself. Rather than immediately terminating her contract and pursuing legal action, which would have been the simplest and most defensible corporate response, Director O spent the following week conducting a quiet, thorough investigation into exactly how the fraud had occurred. Not to find ammunition against Amarachi specifically, but because the deeper she dug, the more she uncovered about her own company's negligence. The leaked internal documents that had made the fraud possible in the first place. The rushed, poorly supervised transition between department heads that had allowed an unverified identity through without basic background confirmation. The broader pattern of corner-cutting under deadline pressure that Crown Wave's rapid international expansion had quietly normalized. The investigation widened further than anyone anticipated when Director O's legal team discovered that the junior staffer responsible for the original document leak, the same leak that had inadvertently given Amarachi the information she needed to construct her fraud, had not acted alone or out of pure whistleblower conscience as the company had initially assumed. The staffer, facing his own internal disciplinary review, admitted under questioning that he had been quietly compensated by a rival entertainment company eager to embarrass Crown Wave during its high-profile international expansion, planting just enough leaked material to create exactly the kind of chaotic, poorly supervised transition window that had allowed Amarachi's fraud to slip through unnoticed. It was a discovery that complicated the company's response considerably, shifting some portion of institutional blame away from simple negligence and toward something closer to corporate sabotage, though Director O was careful, in her internal reports, not to let that complication excuse Amarachi's own choices, however opportunistically they had been enabled. For Director O personally, the case touched a nerve few people at the company knew about. 2 decades earlier, as a junior trainee herself, she had watched a close friend lose a hard-won debut slot to a rival's quiet manipulation of casting paperwork, an injustice that was never formally investigated and that had shaped, more than she usually admitted aloud, her later reputation for obsessive procedural thoroughness. Seeing Yuna Bassey's stolen opportunity laid out across her desk felt, to Director O, uncomfortably familiar, and it was this old, private grievance as much as any corporate liability calculation that pushed her toward a resolution that prioritized genuine accountability over simply making the embarrassing story disappear as quickly and quietly as possible. Director O discovered something else during that week that complicated the situation considerably. The real Yuna Bassey, contacted directly by company representatives investigating the discrepancy, expressed something other than the outrage everyone expected. Weakened by months of recovery, facing a long road of physical therapy before she could realistically resume the kind of grueling training a debut idol required, Yuna admitted with startling honesty that she wasn't certain she could have handled the position even if her accident had never happened. That years of online training from Lagos, however dedicated, had left her unprepared for certain in-person elements of the role that she'd only fully understood once she saw footage of the actual debut performances. She was, she said carefully, more angry about the theft of her identity and opportunity in principle than genuinely devastated about the practical loss of a position she had begun, in the quiet honesty of a hospital recovery room, to privately doubt she was fully ready for .it was the kind of complicated, morally ambiguous detail that refused to resolve the story into simple villain and victim, and it forced everyone involved, Director O, Yuna, and eventually Amarachi herself, into a far more difficult set of decisions than a straightforward fraud case would have required. That we are getting close to the moment this entire story turns. And if you do not want to miss it, this is exactly the right time to hit subscribe. Taeyong, when he finally learned the full truth, did not respond the way Amarachi had braced herself for. She had expected fury, betrayal, the particular cold withdrawal of a man realizing the person he'd fallen for did not, in the legal and bureaucratic sense, exist. Instead, sitting across from her in the same small practice room where they'd spent so many late nights arranging harmonies together, he asked her only one question. Whether anything she had told him about herself, her childhood in Lagos, her years singing backup before this, the specific texture of her hunger to be heard, had been a lie. No, Amarachi said, her voice breaking. Only my name. Everything else was me. It was not, Taeyong would later admit to her, an answer that made the deception acceptable. It did not undo the very real harm done to Yuna Bassey, whose opportunity and identity had been used without her knowledge or consent for nearly 5 months. But it clarified something for him that mattered enormously in deciding how he wanted to move forward. The woman he had fallen for was not a fabrication built specifically to deceive him. She was a real person who had made one catastrophic decision out of desperation and then spent months too cowardly and too afraid to undo it. A flaw serious enough to require real consequences, but not, in his eyes, serious enough to erase everything genuine that had grown between them in the months since. Director O's eventual resolution, announced 3 weeks after the initial discovery, satisfied almost no one completely, which was, in its own way, evidence of how carefully balanced it had been constructed. Amarachi was removed immediately from the debuting group and her fraudulent contract voided entirely, a consequence she accepted without protest. Crown Wave Entertainment, facing potential reputational damage if the story became public in an uncontrolled way, chose instead to control the narrative themselves. They extended a formal, public apology to Yuna Bassey, offered her a new, legitimate contract under her own name with significantly improved terms and a flexible training timeline that accounted for her ongoing physical recovery, and quietly absorbed the financial cost of restructuring the group's promotional materials around a member who needed considerably more time to prepare than the rushed original schedule had allowed. For Amarachi, the consequences were murkier and considerably more painful. Director O, despite everything, had been quietly impressed by the raw talent evident in Amarachi's training footage. Impressed enough that, rather than simply blacklisting her from the Korean entertainment industry entirely, which would have been well within the company's rights and arguably the safer corporate choice, she offered an unusual alternative. Amarachi could remain in Korea on a probationary trainee contract under her real name, starting completely from the bottom of the company's roster with no guarantee of ever debuting, contingent on full transparency with every future collaborator and a formal, recorded apology to Yuna Bassey that Amarachi would need to deliver in person. If you have ever wondered whether forgiveness in a story like this should be earned slowly rather than given freely, you are about to see exactly how that plays out, and the rest of this journey is waiting for you the moment you subscribe. The apology, when it finally happened, took place in a quiet hospital garden in Lagos where Yuna was completing the final stretch of her physical therapy. Amarachi having flown back specifically for the meeting at her own expense, uncertain until the moment she arrived whether Yuna would even agree to see her in person. Yuna, leaning on a cane she would need for several more months, listened to Amarachi's apology in near silence, her expression unreadable for long, uncomfortable minutes after Amarachi finished speaking. "I spent 2 months in a coma not knowing if I'd ever sing again," Yuna finally said. "And you spent those same 2 months singing under my name, in front of cameras, becoming someone people were starting to love, who wasn't even you." She paused, studying Amarachi's face with an intensity that made Amarachi want to look away and made herself, deliberately, not, "I don't know if I forgive you, but I understand wanting something so badly you convince yourself the wrong way of getting it is somehow not as wrong as it actually is. I understand that feeling better than I wish I did. It was not absolution. It was something more honest than that, an acknowledgement between two women who had both, in radically different circumstances, understood exactly how desperately a person could want to be chosen, to be seen, to be given a chance the world seemed determined to withhold." Yuna did not become Amarachi's friend that day, and the story does not pretend that a single garden conversation could undo months of genuine harm. But she did agree, eventually, weeks later, to appear alongside Amarachi in a brief joint statement Crown Wave Entertainment released to manage the story's eventual public emergence. A statement that emphasized accountability and consequence rather than scandal, an unusually mature piece of crisis communication that several industry commentators would later cite as a rare example of an entertainment company handling a fraud scandal with more honesty than self-protection. Amarachi spent the following year rebuilding her career from the absolute bottom of Crown Wave's roster, training alongside trainees 5 and 6 years younger than her, enduring the particular humiliation of starting over in a system designed for people half her age with none of her professional experience, all while carrying the quiet, ever-present knowledge that a single further mistake would end the unusual second chance she'd been given. Taeyong stayed with her through all of it, not as a man rescuing a woman from consequences she deserved to face, but as someone who had decided, deliberately and with open eyes, that loving her meant supporting her through the genuinely difficult work of earning back trust rather than shielding her from the discomfort of having to do so. This part of the story is where everything they built finally gets tested for real, and you will want to be subscribed for what happens next, because the hardest year of Amarachi's life is only just beginning here. The year was not without its setbacks. Twice, journalists who had caught wind of rumors about the scandal approached Amarachi directly for comment, and twice she had to relearn, painfully, the difference between transparency and self-destruction, working with Crown Wave's legal team to navigate questions honestly without reopening wounds for Yuna that didn't need reopening for the sake of someone else's career rehabilitation. Once, A fellow trainee who discovered the full story through industry gossip confronted Amarachi publicly during a practice session, calling her a fraud in front of the entire training class. An accusation Amarachi did not argue against, choosing instead to simply finish the day's rehearsal in silence and let her improved standing with instructors over the following month speak more honestly than any defense she could have offered in the heat of the moment. The hardest stretch came around the 7-month mark, when Amarachi's probationary status came up for its first formal review. Director O, true to the unusual arrangement she designed, convened a small panel of vocal coaches, choreographers, and company executives to evaluate not just Amarachi's technical progress but her conduct, her honesty in daily interactions, and the genuine sentiment of trainees and staff who had worked alongside her since her return. The review was brutal in its thoroughness. Instructors who had initially been sympathetic to her situation now spoke candidly about moments where her old instinct toward shortcuts had resurfaced under pressure. A missed vocal lesson she tried to quietly make up rather than report. A choreography note she'd once let a junior trainee take the blame for before correcting herself 2 days later out of evident guilt. None of it was severe enough to end her contract outright, but it was enough for Director O to extend her probation by an additional 6 months. A decision that devastated Amarachi privately even as she understood, with clear eyes, exactly why it was fair. It was Taeyong, during that difficult stretch, who refused to let her retreat into the old pattern of believing she simply wasn't capable of doing things the honest way. He began sitting in on her vocal sessions not as her composer but as an unofficial accountability partner, encouraging her to flag her own mistakes before instructors found them, to ask for help the moment she felt overwhelmed rather than quietly trying to manage everything alone the way her old desperation had once taught her to. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that makes for poor highlight reels but genuine character change, and by the time her extended probation period ended, even the instructors who had voted to extend it acknowledged a visible shift in how she carried herself. Less like someone performing reform for an audience and more like someone who had actually quietly become a different version of who she used to be. Slowly, through a combination of genuine talent, hard-won humility, and the kind of consistent, unglamorous discipline that no amount of charisma could substitute for, Amarachi rebuilt something resembling a legitimate career. She did not debut in a major group, the way her fraudulent identity once nearly allowed her to. Instead, 18 months after the scandal first broke, Crown Wave Entertainment quietly released her debut as a soloist, marketed honestly from the outset as an artist with a complicated, publicly acknowledged past. Her music drawing explicitly on the West African vocal traditions she had once tried to borrow under someone else's name and now, finally, performed entirely as herself. Her debut single, co-written with Taeyong and built around the same Yoruba-Korean vocal blending that had first drawn him to her months earlier, performed modestly by major industry standards but found an unexpectedly devoted audience among listeners specifically drawn to its unusual cultural fusion, and, once her story became more widely known through a candid magazine interview she gave entirely on her own terms, to the unusual honesty of an artist who had built her second chance on the explicit foundation of having earned it rather than having been quietly forgiven behind closed doors. The decision to make her past public at all, rather than quietly hoping it stayed buried, had not been an easy one. Amarachi initially resisted the idea of any disclosure, terrified that a permanent association with fraud would overshadow whatever music she made for the rest of her career. It was Taeyong who eventually convinced her otherwise, arguing that an audience built on concealment would only ever be one leaked detail away from collapsing the same way her fraudulent identity once had, and that she deserved a foundation sturdier than a secret. Director O, weighing in with characteristic bluntness during a final planning meeting, pointed out that the company's own legal exposure made some eventual disclosure inevitable regardless of anyone's personal comfort, and that Crown Wave would rather control the story on Amarachi's terms, through one candid interview, than risk a tabloid stumbling onto it years later with far less sympathy attached. The interview, when it finally ran, surprised even the company's public relations team with how it landed. Not a scandal, but as an unusually honest account of failure and slow repair, the kind so rarely offered in an industry built on tightly managed images. The final scene finds Amarachi backstage at a small but completely sold-out venue in Seoul, 18 months after the apology in that Lagos hospital garden, preparing for her first solo headlining performance. Taeyong stands beside her, no longer just her composer but her partner in every sense the word implies, having proposed to her quietly 6 weeks earlier in the same small practice room where their relationship first began, presenting her with a ring during a late-night writing session because, he told her, he didn't see the point of waiting for some more dramatic moment when the ordinary ones were where they'd always understood each other best. A message arrives on Amarachi's phone moments before she walks on stage. A short, simple text from Yuna Bassey, who has, in the months since their garden conversation, slowly built her own legitimate solo career running parallel to Amarachi's. The two of them maintaining a careful, evolving relationship that exists somewhere between professional courtesy and the cautious beginnings of something more genuine. The message reads simply, "Break a leg out there. We both know what it cost you to earn this one honestly. Amarachi reads it twice, tucks the phone away, and walks toward the stage lights, no longer borrowing anyone else's.